Thanks very much for watching On Point. We continue to reflect on Workers' Day as people enjoy some time off on this public holiday. Many employed South Africans are unhappy, saying that they're barely able to afford the basics on the one hand. Then on the other hand, millions of South Africans of working age are unemployed, which is placing the fiscus under strain as it seeks to ensure a social safety net for many, including the COVID-19 related social relief of distress grant, which is set to be phased out at the end of March 2023. And then you also have business that complains about the country's labour regulations and their rigidity, which they argue is a disincentive to creating more jobs. Or to explore some of the themes that I've just outlined, I'm joined now by Onyi Nwaneri. She's the CEO of Afrika Tikkun Services. Thank you very much for joining us, Onyi. So in your view, how bad is the skills deficit in the economy, which often results in those who do work earning meagre wages, as well as obviously the current high unemployment situation?
Good morning, or is it good afternoon to you, and good afternoon to your listeners. We currently have a conundrum in the economy. We have a conundrum in the sense that we have a high unemployment rate. We've seen, especially in the young youth sector, we have 66% unemployment rate in terms of young people between the age of 18 to 35. But at the same time, we have skills shortages, and therefore is a mismatch between the skills that is needed in order to create jobs and the unemployment rates that we currently have in the country. So the challenge that we have is looking at how do we, as workers, as we celebrate Workers' Day, not just look at other people to take responsibility for skills development for ourselves, but also for us to start taking some form of responsibility for skills in our country. So the mismatch, and I often say this, it's not like there is no jobs. If you look in the tech sector, for example, or the digital economy, there's 66,000 jobs that is currently estimated to exist in that sector. And I think the challenge is how do we get people currently, employees currently as we speak, but also those who have lost their jobs or those who have never been employed to match the level of skills and competence that is required by employers.
Now, economists have often spoken about the labour market being rigid, and some even have issues with the national minimum wage. But surely a decent wage, if you can call 23 Rand an hour that, is critical because, of course, people have to go out there and at least be able to afford the basics. So what do you understand to be businesses' gripes around the labour landscape?
From everything that we have observed as Afrika Tikkun Services is the comparison between the labor landscape in South Africa to other competing economies. Competing economies are other similar developing economies across the world. And in particular, if you're comparing India, you're comparing China, you're comparing Eastern Europe, you would see automatically that the cost of labor is very expensive in South Africa. And if you compare that, if you include the fact that labor comparatively to other developing countries does not have the same level of skills, then it becomes a challenge. So I think the gripe of business from everything we have in engaging with business around employment for young people, especially for the speaking to the high unemployment rates, is that if you had a rand or a dollar to spend, where would you get the best bulk for your money? All things being equal, then South Africa becomes a very difficult one. And so there's always the concept of the free market economy, that demand and supply should dictate the forces of the market. That if there is demand for labor, then the supply of labor should meet the requirements of that demand. And I think that as long as we are trying to grapple with the concept of free market, how do we make it easier for supply to happen and therefore for employment to be created, especially comparatively with all other developing countries in the world, then we've got a problem. And so on the one hand, there's an appetite challenge, which is how do we level the playing field? How do we create equity, equality, and justice? On the other hand, we are competing with the rest of the world. And how do we compete, all things being equal?
Yeah, very tricky. So, of course, you indicate that productivity in the country, in the economy, has been falling by around 5% per annum for the last number of years. Of Of course, that's quite worrying because greater productivity speaks to greater economic growth, greater job creation, etc., etc. But what is it that you think needs to happen for there to be more productivity in the country?
I honestly believe that if we stop seeing our companies, or whether private or public sector companies, as places where we go to work, places where others have to pay us in order for us to deliver a service to them, and see it from the whole to the parts, because we often look at the parts, that is my contribution, myself in a company, or whatever that company is, whether it's a small business, a not-for-profit, and you're not necessarily seeing that company as a whole and yourself as being a part of that company. And therefore, your contribution enables the success of that company and therefore the success of the country. Then we start seeing a very different picture, because we often lose sight that a company is made up of people who decide whether it succeeds or not. And therefore, I really want to use this opportunity to encourage fellow South Africans and workers to realize that the real challenge of growth is dependent on our contribution, is dependent on our productivity, and realizing that a company does not make itself succeed. People do. A country does not succeed by itself. People do. And therefore, if we turn around the question and make it about what can I do for my company, what value can I create in order to drive growth in my company and consequently the country, then we will see the productivity beginning to change in all ramifications.
So, Onyi, lastly, in your capacity at Afrika Tikkun, what interventions are you seeing the private sector getting involved in to boost the skills gap across a number of industries?
We have been part of many industry-related formations that is looking to, one, bringing back those jobs that are being outsourced to Eastern Europe. And the only way to do that is to increase the level of skills and the competence of skills in the country. So I know there is a lobby group saying, if we can bring at least 10% of the jobs that South African companies are currently outsourcing outside of the country and bring it home, we'll see more jobs in the country. The second element that Afrika Tikkun Services has been doing is working with a number of companies to look at what are the in-demand skills, what is digital economy, the current economy, and the fourth industrial revolution, what is the skills that is required in order to match people into the right economic positions or jobs. And then the third element is, how do we create entrepreneurship? How do we enable people to start becoming job creators themselves? And as Afrika Tikkun Services, we've been working with a lot of companies as well as the public sector, government, to look at, how do we stimulate and ignite entrepreneurship, especially in freelancing within the country. And then finally, we're also looking in partnership with the Youth Employment Service to say, if the challenge is work experience, and you say people can't get jobs without work experience, but they can, if they don't have the work experience, they cannot also get jobs. So how do we increase the level of not just skills, but also work experience by working collaboratively with the private and the public sector to bring the level of skills, competence, and experience into the country, and hopefully persuade the business sector to create those jobs, but also persuade unemployed people to courageously create that jobs themselves as well.
Onyi, thank you very much for your time and insights there. Onyi Nwaneri, she's the CEO of Afrika Tikkun Services. We're going to go for a quick break. We'll have